also the BC Arts Council, because they helped make this series possible. Tonight we have Ben, and I'm going to introduce Jeremy. Jeremy is our painting teacher, so he's going to introduce our artist. But I just also wanted to let you know that our next talk is March 7th, and it's an artist from Seattle, Lighting Tennis. So just stay tuned for that as well. So this is Jeremy, he teaches painting. I just wanted you to know that there's other people at these beside myself. So that's why Jeremy's doing the introduction.
Yeah. Thanks, Marie. So yeah, this is Ben Reeves. I know Ben from doing master's program in art. He was my thesis supervisor. A few facts about Ben. He's a Vancouver artist and teacher with a materially and conceptually based drawing and painting practice. His recent work focuses on the potential of the brushstroke for densely layered signification, along with its simultaneous and placeable material immediacy. This is nicely written. Did you write it? He has exhibited.
Mine was more glowing.
He has exhibited extensively in national venues as well as in the U.S., England, and China. Reeves is represented by Equinox Gallery in Vancouver and Jessica Bradley in Toronto. He is currently associate professor in the Faculty of Visual Art and Material Practice and the Faculty of Graduate Studies at Emily Carr University in Vancouver. It was a great pleasure for me to work with Ben, somebody who is very thoughtful and mindful and can really dig into the meaning of the work and help you to see what your work is actually saying. It was an essential part of my program that I was able to work with Ben. So I'm really happy to introduce him to see Ben.
I should say it was, well, I'm thrilled to be here. And it was a privilege to work with you, actually. Jeremy's a great painter, a very thoughtful person, and it's one of those kind of situations that they come about rarely as an instructor, but they're the best kind, where, you know, if you were just saying at dinner, it felt like a collaboration, and I certainly gained a lot from working with Jeremy. So. Yeah, what else should I say? I'm happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. I can't believe people came. So I am going to apologize because I like to advance my own images. I prefer to be up here so that I can speak to you, but I need to be back here to move things forward. So I might dance around a little bit, and I hope you can hear me well enough and you don't. I'm not offending anyone if you're looking at my back for a while, and I hope everyone can see. It's absolutely fine by me if you have questions while I'm speaking to call them out, and I will try to answer them. It makes for sometimes a more tailored conversation that's a little more engaging maybe. But barring that, I'm certainly happy to answer questions at the end as well. So this talk, I've tailored it to be just under 6 hours, and with big gaps of silence. English first. I'm starting with this piece that you see up there for a few different reasons. One is that I'm more primarily known now as a painter, but I typically don't describe myself that way. I still just call myself an artist, and it's because I don't want to be defined by a medium, I suppose. So painting for me is a really useful medium to think through the process of painting and the material of painting, but it doesn't, again, define what I'm thinking about or who I am, I suppose. So this is just sort of a reminder to me and maybe to you as well that I do other things. But primarily I'm starting with this work because it sort of maybe in one way, shape, or form illustrates a few things that I think thread through my practice. So the things that I'll show you tonight, maybe you'll see some of the themes or thoughts that I'll mention in relation to this piece sort of popping up in other works. I'm showing a selection of images of my work that have been produced in the last 10 years or so. And I will proceed roughly chronologically, but I'm going to break the rule chronological order just at the beginning. This is a more recent piece, about 2 years old. And then I'll jump back in time and slowly work forward. I'm interested in how objects or materials or gestures can have multiple identities. Maybe simultaneously, or maybe they can shift their identity from one thing to another as you look at them or think about them in different ways. So this is just a hose that I bought at Canadian Tire. Jeremy actually saw this, he just mentioned he had seen it and puzzled over it. It was in the faculty show at Emily Carr University. I think I offended some faculty by nailing a hose to the wall when they, labored over works and so on. But I didn't mean to be flippant, or too flippant anyway. But so it's just a hose from Canadian Tire, and it came coiled up. So it's very minimal intervention on my part. I just kind of opened the package and stretched the coil out a little bit and stuck it on the wall. So there's one identity of a hose nailed to a wall. Not necessarily a piece of art yet, but once it's stretched out there and it's on a white wall, suddenly it's a figure on a ground. Right? And it's a line. It's a swirling line. And I don't know, when I was a kid, before I could write, that's what I drew to indicate writing. So this kind of scribble, this cursive script before I could actually do it. So suddenly it's not just a hose, it's a figure, it's a line, it's about language, it's about writing. It's also about this kind of endless quality suggested in it. It's this repeating pattern, a cyclical pattern. And so it suggests that it could, even though the hose ends, that it could carry on at either end forever. So very quickly I'm stepping from a number of things, from a hose all the way to the idea of infinity, right? And there are other things besides. The title of the work is Beyond Me, the Earth Will Roll in the Heavens, which is a fragment of an incomplete poem by Georges Bataille. So that's one idea, that one object can have multiple identities. Another thing that's also been hinted at in that, I'm interested in, it seems to come up in my work over and over again, and it's not necessarily deliberate. A lot of what I do isn't necessarily entirely deliberate, and it's kind of nice to have an occasion like this as a talk to reflect back on the work and see these patterns emerge and how I produce things and what I'm thinking about. It kind of reveals stuff to me. But often my work does seem to be about or related to issues around notions of the sublime. And so I spoke about the kind of infinite quality that this might relate to. And the title of it, The Earth Will Roll in the Heavens, relates to this idea of the cycling of celestial bodies and this kind of vastness, right? So there is that idea of the sublime that's sort of hovering here. But I think that it's kind of embarrassing to earnestly sort of tackle the sublime in a head-on way, or to think that you can express the inexpressible in that sense directly. So it does seem that in my practice I find that I tend to approach it somewhat obliquely, and typically through the banal. So, or the commonplace, the everyday. It's kind of an unexpected route to get to the sublime. And that sort of also hints at something that I'm also interested in, is how language tends to define things in terms of opposition, these poles of opposing ideas. So you get the banal and sublime and various things like that. And later on I'll talk about representation and abstraction maybe in a similar kind of way. But the truth of the matter is these things aren't so clearly opposed to one another, aren't so discrete from one another. So this is one example where arguably through something that's quite banal, like a garden hose, I might reach ideas of the sublime. So I'm kind of contradicting some of the operations of language through a material practice and object.
Can I ask a question at this point?
Sorry?
Can I ask a question at this point?
Another
Is it
one?
too soon?
No, that's it. Okay, yes, you may ask a question. No, it's not too soon. And
Did you have all that in your head when you when you put the hose on the wall? Or,
when I nailed the hose
or
to the wall.
was it afterwards you thought, wow, there's all this in there?
That's kind of an impossible question for me to really honestly answer. I think that I had some of it in my head. And like I say, when I'm putting together a talk like this, I start to recognize things in the work. And I start to make a story out of it. Hopefully, it's not that I'm trying to create a fiction around what I do, it's just that I'm trying to explain the work in a useful way. And that's always the kind of conversation here is always something different from the work itself. But yeah, there were inklings of some of these thoughts, not all of them, I would say. That's my best guess, really. I mean, things that I discovered afterwards, or thought of afterwards, was that the Emily Carr logo, I don't know if anyone here knows it, but it's this kind of, these circles that are cycling endlessly kind of over top of one another. And it's kind of like a hose before it was stretched out a bit. So I'm, you know, if this was a kind of flippant kind of act in an Emily Carr faculty show, that relationship to the logo sort of starts to inhere in that moment, in that space. And I didn't think of that beforehand, for example. But thought of it afterwards when I saw the work there and wondered if I was offending anyone. And then, sorry, so to get back to the, so there was, the third thing about this work that I wanted to just bring up was that all of this possibility that a hose might present to me, and maybe to you, I don't know, it only happens at the behest of the audience. So there were lots of people that walked by and didn't see this, so it never even existed as a hose, let alone anything else. There were a lot of people that glanced at it and saw a hose nailed to the wall and went, what was that? And kept going. So it only rested as a hose there. But if anyone stopped and maybe read the title, some of the ideas that I'm talking about might have sort of come out of it for them. And then, you know, then these things are possible. But it's at the behest of the viewer. So that's something that's really important to me as well, is the viewer in all of this and their agency to allow work to function. Okay. So I'll step back in time from here, but you'll see that this work relates to the earlier work that I'm going to show next, which is, okay, so this is an installation of extension cords all plugged into one another, into one continuous loop closed circuit, suspended in a gallery space. And it was part of a traveling show, a Canadian painting show called Lines Painted in Early Spring, and it traveled to various venues right across the country, and I had to install it at each site. Every time I went, it was very different. The circumstances were different, and it seemed that I got better, I think, at installing it and playing with the extension cords, so it got kind of bigger. It kept growing on me and getting denser as well. Every stop I went to, I had to go to the local Canadian Tire and buy all the extension cords to flesh it out, because more was always needed, it seemed. I was thinking about this in relation to modernist art practice and this kind of notion of the autonomous art object. So that's probably centrally what I was responding to with this idea. That's why it's one continuous circuit that's complete and contained in and of itself. So it's about this kind of referencing these seemingly essential, pure form of modernist artwork. But there's also this kind of recognition that these things are always contingent in one way or another, always reference outside themselves, or need some sort of context in order to function, perhaps. So that's why extension cords, they're these kind of, again, these kind of everyday materials. And I first started doing these installations using the extension cords that have been kicking around my studio. So they were dirty, they'd been scuffed up. They had this history of prior use that was apparent on their surfaces. So in the one hand, there's this kind of lyrical, formal gestures of a line, a colored line sweeping through the gallery space. But at the same moment, they have this kind of other presence as an extension cord. And inevitably, even if you get kind of caught up in the lyrical flow of the gestures, you'll come to these points where the plugs are joined together, and there are these literal black plugs there that immediately jar you out of that way of looking. So there's always this kind of push and pull, this contest within the work. And inevitably, given the different gallery spaces and the ways that the painting was a part of a painting show, the ways that show was configured in different gallery settings, the work had to respond to those things. So it had to sort of shift its placement according to architecture and various things like that. So it always was contingent on space and the organization of the show and various other things. How many blue cords Canadian Tire had in canvas, for example. Things like that. Also, it was interesting because as I first started making these installations, I was very I wanted to dictate how the line snaked through the air. Right? So I wanted to control the extension cords as much as I could. But extension cords, when they're wound up and coiled up and shipped off to the next gallery, they have a really great and fairly strong physical memory. So they want to maintain their coiled up position as much as they can. So as it went along, I learned that it was beneficial to actually try and work with them, to work with what they want to do and allow them to sort of snake through the air on their own. And then they started actually to defy gravity in a more convincing fashion and do their own things, and unexpected forms and shapes started to emerge that were surprising to me, that I would have never invented. So it really kind of was weirdly a collaboration with me and extension cords. And I think that this work certainly intentionally references different kinds of historical works, and it was in a painting show, and in that context specifically, things like the schemes of paint from the Jackson Pollock action painting, or maybe more specifically a Bryce Martin kind of constructed composition would be
Just very quickly, did you hang the cords individually, or did you plug them all in and then hang them back?
This is 2003. Did I hang them individually? It was a mixture. So they had to. I would typically have a bunch hanging that I would have to work with and thread through. I remember that, and figure out that the hard part was always ensuring the singular cert in that. So it was a bit of a mental puzzle as it went along. But yeah, typically there'd be numbers of them hanging, and it was generally they needed to go from top down, I think. It'd be harder and more annoying to work from bottom up. So kind of did the high ones first and worked your way down.
What was the name of that?
I think it's called Workspace. Yeah. It was kind of a crappy title. But anyway, that's what I called it at the time. Here are a couple of details of that, so you can sort of see the density of the chords, and as you look through it. This particular installation, I think, was at UQAM in Montreal. As I said, it did get configured differently depending on the gallery space. I think at the Kamloops Art Gallery, it did actually flow above your heads. You walk under it down a corridor and actually sort of seep into rooms almost like smoke or something, which was a more kind of dramatic installation than I generally would have in mind, but it seemed like an interesting opportunity. This is more of a classic installation where it kind of maintains its own sort of space in the gallery, in the white cube. And I guess Cy Twombly would be another reference here as well. Did I mention Cy Twombly with the hose? I meant to mention Cy Twombly with the hose. That's not obvious. Okay. Now, this, actually, I will step back just a little bit once again, but only very briefly in time. This is a slightly earlier drawing than the extension cord installation. And this is maybe where the extension cord thinking came from. I've been ripping apart appliances around my house, which probably my relationship with my girlfriend at the time, because I take these things apart and draw every little detail that I could find in them. I draw the screws, the circuit boards, the wires, everything that I could find in the toaster. And I'm not very good at putting things back together here. I did our television as well, that was maybe a mistake. Our washing machine too, actually. But we were getting a new one soon anyway, so that was okay. But I sort of was doing those drawings, and I would, similar to the extension cords and the hose, I didn't want to use fine arts objects or implements in this case to draw with, so I'd just pick up the kind of everyday ballpoint pen and gel pens to do these drawings with. When I started them, I had this idea maybe that if I looked at these appliances and drew every little detail, every part inside them, that I sort of gained some sort of control or maybe not understanding or comfort with them that I don't generally have. So we're surrounded by technology, and I don't typically understand how it works. So sometimes that might be slightly anxiety-inducing for me. So that was anyway the gist of where this came from. But these things advanced and they started to, because of the density of detail in these drawings, they started to operate certainly as this kind of hyper-representation, but also they had a very abstract quality to them when the mass of the detail started to overwhelm, in some senses, the readability of the drawing. So that's where this drawing of wires would have come from. And it's about 33 by 44 inches, I think. And it was just sort of done in whatever scraps of spare time I would have at work and during the day. Over the course of a year and a half, it slowly evolved. And it was kind of an oddly trying but meditative practice. I remember I started the drawing somewhere up in here. And it wasn't planned out at all. This is a fiction, actually. So it's different from the other appliance drawing, where this was a completely invented tangle of wires. But I was interested, I was thinking again, just like with the extension cords, I was thinking that each wire is this, I was thinking of it as a kind of formal gesture in a picture. So this time what's a little unique here, I guess, is that each gesture is actually being studied by two other gestures. So like each movement, each wire is self-consciously made with twin contour lines. So my lines are actually kind of studying lines in a weird kind of way. So it's quite a bit of a self-conscious kind of activity. It was quite trying to do in a sense. It's at points quite tedious, I think, because it was being drawn straight out of ballpoint pen and gel pen. I had to make sure, it was kind of like a mental puzzle, sort of like the extension cords, where I always wanted to leave like spaces and gaps for the wires so that I didn't end up in a situation where there was one wire on top of all the others. I wanted it all to be wrapped together in this kind of big, massive tangle. So, you know, it took a lot of concentration as I was doing, but as part of my brain was concentrating and really getting tired, another part of my brain seemed like it had nothing to do, right? So it would kind of wander, and I'd find myself daydreaming. As I'm concentrating really intently, I'm also daydreaming. It's a really kind of weird experience. And each wire sort of started to become a character in a story at different times in these daydreams. So like, you know, there'd be two wires that would come together and they would become intertwined, and it was a love story. It was quite sweet. And then maybe they go along and then they split apart, and I'd actually feel sad as I'm drawing. Why am I feeling sad? And I said, oh yeah, but maybe I thought, you know, maybe they'll get together again somewhere later in the drawing, so I feel a little better, things like that. Or two wires would sort of start to come together and then one would veer off, and it was kind of unrequited love, right? Or maybe three wires would come together, and, but that's maybe a little bit X-rated for tonight. So, but the point being that it was interesting how the structures, when thought of in kind of abstract terms, started to become potential models for ideas of social interactions and social sort of structures and engagements and so on. Again, there are these the wires themselves at a certain point can be thought of as formal gestures, maybe you can kind of get caught up in that. And then the things, just like in the extension cord installation, when the wires are twisted together, or there's a bit of tape binding a grouping of wires together, or a moret joining a circuit, those sorts of more literal representations kind of jar you out of a more formal engagement with the piece. So it's sort of playing back and forth like that again. So after working with contour line in this way, and using contour line, as I was saying, if it made any sense, line to study, or these contour line gestures to study gesture, I started thinking about doing more of that. And don't worry, I will change the image soon. But I was trying to think about what would be interesting to use contour line to do. And I was thinking about, well, one use of contour line is based on its investment in the idea of the physical reality of things. So one way that contour line is typically used is to chart the edges of things in space and position things in space. So it's really attached to physical reality. And so I started thinking, well, it could be interesting to try and find moments to apply contour line to something that couldn't wholly be defined as in terms of its physical realities. So there were many failed attempts that weren't at all interesting, but eventually I remember one day I was looking at these painted panels, these little paintings I had made for a show at the Surrey Art Gallery. They were on my apartment wall, and I started just thinking, what would happen if I tried to draw those with contour line, the surface of those paintings? What would I do? Well, one most obvious thing that people would probably do is they'd look at, these were representational paintings, so they'd probably look at the image in the painting and draw it out. But I was thinking, no, what if I actually use the contour line drawing as I described it before to chart the physical surface of the painting, the brush strokes and the ridges and gullies of the paint itself. So that seemed kind of more interesting and slightly perverse, which I like. So that's what I started to try and do, and the way that the representational painting was built was in line with the image, but also kind of divergent from it a bit. I don't have actual images of the earlier drawings to show you today, but I'll show you soon one that's very related to them, so you'll get an idea of this. But so I made these drawings of these, the surfaces of the painting, every ridge, every kind of bristle mark in the painting. They were really, really intensely rigorous and careful drawings, trying to map it out really accurately. And at a certain point, I do remember waking up and realizing, like, I don't just have to draw my own paintings, I can draw other people's as well. So that's what led me to this next project, which I will show you, which is based on Bruegel's Tower of Babel painting. Now, I have to admit, I made my own study. This is my own study of his paintings, a lot looser than his. And I eliminated King Nimrod and his men from the foreground. I went to Rotterdam to see his Tower of Babel, and it's the other one that's surviving. This one, the one this is based on, is actually in Vienna. Oops. But anyway, at the time I was concerned that there was a kind of conceptual compromise here by me making my own painting to draw. Why not draw directly from his? But there were some practical reasons. One is that I didn't obviously know where his painting was. Another one is that he was trained as a miniaturist, so his brushwork isn't that available in his quite small painting. Relatively small, considering the sort of grandness of the subject. And in the end, actually, everything's being filtered through my own subjectivity. So I don't think that's really an excuse. I think it actually does kind of fit. But if anyone has any thoughts or comments on that, I'm always keen to hear it. I always ask, and no one ever disagrees with me on that. But it would be nice to hear. Anyway, so here's the drawing. Well, I did a couple of drawings of this. And this time, because it was kind of more monumental subject matter, my drawings, which had been graphite on paper of my own smaller paintings and done at a 1-to-1 scale of the painting, this time I shifted and I made my drawing a lot bigger than his painting. And this final drawing was 6 by 8 feet. So I did it on stretched, primed canvas with charcoal pencil. So I deliberately brought it back right to the surface of painting. I was interested in the story of the Tower of Babel from the Old Testament. And the story being that the first people shared this prime language, this first language. And there was this kind of theoretical possibility in the story, that seems to be posited by the story, that this first language had the capability of expressing things in an absolute way, with perfection. So that what was said was precisely what was meant, and there was no gap between signifier and signifier. So with this kind of absolute power of communication, it seems that it's implied in the story that with that kind of great potential of a perfect language and a perfect ability to describe and depict things, this enterprise of building a tower that would reach up to the Godhead and ultimately place human beings at the level of a God would be possible. So that to me is a really compelling and interesting story around the idea of language and around the idea of representation in general. But of course this was a sin, so God needed to thwart this plan. And this is another aspect of the story that makes it even, again, more interesting, I think, is that God, he or she, did not send a great tempest to rip the tower apart or a giant flood to wash it away, but instead made it so that everyone was speaking different languages and couldn't understand each other as easily as before, or communicate in such a perfect way anymore. Derrida and Foucault described this story as the symbolic birthplace of translation. Suddenly translation is required. And with translation, there's always a gap between, what was said and what was meant. It shifts, things shift. It's not absolute perfection anymore in terms of what is the signifier and what was meant to be signified. And with that, the project fell apart. Right? This is also, the story is also a symbolic birthplace of the great cultural diaspora that spread all the diverse cultures and ethnicities around the globe too. And I think that in the drawing there is this kind of entropic quality to it where the tower is kind of starting to, I mean it's still solidly there, but more so than the painting it's coming apart a little bit, dissolving into the ground and spreading. I was conscious that in drawing out every brush stroke and so on, I was kind of drawing the fundamental building blocks of a painterly structure or language for a representational painting. And I was thinking that similar to, if you hear someone speaking a foreign language that you don't know, you can hear pretty much everything they're saying, but the content is lost, right? And so this has a parallel to that, where here I am drawing all those aspects of the visual language, all the fundamental building blocks of it, the formal aspects of it, but the content is slipping away. So it's sort of like a visual babbling. I'll show a detail from the base of the tower here, so you can get a sense of the kind of way that I was recording each brushstroke. And I don't know, there were a number of surprising things related to language that would happen for me in the tower itself and so on. Because it was charcoal pencil on canvas, I had to be really careful not to smudge it as I was working. So I started up there. It was all gridded off so I could be as accurate as possible. And I worked across in the grid from left to right and top to bottom. And then later I realized, well, that's how Westerners write. So this kind of connection to language kept coming up in different ways. And in different parts of the structure of the architecture, it also started to look like some form of writing at times too. What am I going to show next? Oh, yeah, that detail. And then, yeah, this is another occasion where I did a similar drawing project based on another artist's work. I moved to London, Ontario, where I started teaching at the University of Western Ontario, teaching painting. And in the Museum London gift shop, on one of those little racks of cards, there was this card with this image on it, which is a sketch by Tom Thompson. It was a funny kind of moment because as soon as I saw this image on this card, I was like, aha, there it is. I've been waiting for this. It was a strange moment because I had no idea I was waiting for this, but some part of the back of my brain was looking for something like this, apparently, and I found it. And so immediately I knew I wanted to work with this image. And it wasn't the overall scene. I mean, it's a nice little painting, I guess, but Thompson's done ones that I think are a lot better. But for me, it's these geese in the sky. Thompson's sketch was called Wild Geese. I think it's from like 1916 or 17, something like that. For me, immediately they were Canada geese. So these wild geese shifted to Canada geese and took on a greater significance, like a kind of national emblem. Canada geese. They were also significant because they were painted by Tom Thompson. And I think what it was that really interested me right away is that when you look closely at them, they're just these little blobs of paint. They're pretty unremarkable in a way when you sort of zoom in on them. These little dabs of purplish gray paint. But they, well, the question for me was, how could a little dab of this ground up minerals and oil have anything to do with the goose in flight in the world in the first place? Let alone, if I thought of them now as Canada geese, have anything significant about them in terms of our nation. And then, given that they came from the hand of Tom Thompson, this mythic, heroic Canadian outdoorsman artist, like, how does that inhere in them at all? And how do they become culturally significant? So all these kinds of questions were circling around these blobs of paint. So I was able to get into the vaults in Museum London, and this time work directly from the historical piece itself. So I started by doing this drawing of the overall painting of Thompson's, but it wasn't, again, the overall scene that was of the most interest to me. It was those geese, those geese blobs in the sky, these blobs of paint flying through the sky. So this is a detail of the first drawing, just to remind myself to mention that it wasn't the overall, it was these that I was interested in. And so I redrew them and excised them from their context in the painting and drew them first on these two larger sheets of paper. So I enlarged the blobs quite a bit. The overall drawing here is about 8 feet wide on these two sheets of paper. I let the bottom of the paper come loose, and I raised the page on the right just to indicate this, or to give a sense of this notion of lifting and flight. So here are these blobs, like, lifting and flying through the air. So yeah, I was interested in stretching the tension between these kind of blobby forms and geese. Like, how far could I stretch it and have any kind of connection remain? So I was, a few years later, I'd been developing this project for a while, actually, and I showed different parts of it in different places. But I was lucky enough to show it in Museum London, and to be able to show it beside or alongside the Tom Thompson sketch that generated it. So there's the Thompson sketch on the left, and there's my drawing from it on the right. And then, but that drawing on the right for me didn't take it far enough. I did want to stretch this further, sort of push it to the point of absurdity if it hadn't already reached that, or maybe beyond. So I started making these drawings on the right-hand side here, which are the individual blobs enlarged to roughly goose size. And so then I've never had a wall big enough to display the entire passage of them, but we did a section of these blobs in flight. And so yeah, so all of those kinds of references and inflections, I was interested in how they might appear or not appear in these drawings. A friend of mine, Chris Down, wrote a review of this work for Canadian Art, and he had a great phrase that I really liked for them. He called them terse, each one of like terse linguistic units, which I quite like. So they become framed so that they're their own singular things, but now they're also displayed in a larger passage. So they have an individual autonomy potentially that's being displayed here, but they're also part of a larger whole as well.
Can I ask what you're drawing in there? Is this?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I should have said. So this is on, I can't remember what kind of paper, but it was white. And the drawing is, it's non-compressed charcoal, so like willow stick. So here's one of them closer up. And what happened to them, and I wasn't necessarily fully aware of it at the time, and maybe I'm asserting something that isn't true, I don't know, but it does seem to me that these things started to gain their own character. They started to become their own selves. So they might have been influenced and informed by this large, ridiculous process that I went to arrive at these drawings. But they seem to become their own characters, with their own kind of activity and lives, in a sense. So they're a hybrid of all that stuff, the Canada Goose, the idea of Tom Thompson as this mythic artist, but they're also their own thing. So they sort of seem to me to operate as a kind of new proposition, in a sense.
And Another question about them, did you blow up those originals to see the brush stroke, or have you decided what you think it might look like?
That's a really
How did
good
you do
question.
that?
These ones were like an iterative trail. So, and very much like how I presented it now without saying it explicitly, what you're asking. So the first drawing was directly from Thompson's sketch. The next drawing was from my drawing, and so on. Right, so they've sort of advanced forward, each from building from the last piece. This one always looks to me like it's flying backwards, but don't worry, this is the right way around. And this one, to me, I don't know what you guys think, but to me, this, I always think of this, it looks more like a turkey. Doesn't it? Yeah. All right. So in some ways, maybe these drawings were, in terms of my drawings from paintings, in a certain way, these might have been my most successful ones, I think. But a lot of the discussion around the drawings I've made of paintings really were, when I give talks like this or speak about the work and have questions about it, or when people write about the work, a lot of the discussion was based around how the works were deconstructing painting, taking it apart, analyzing, which is absolutely true, they were. But that seemed to me to be part of the story, or part of the story that I wanted to get at. For me, this kind of deconstruction was a prelude towards constructing a new picture. So it seemed to be what I needed to do. I needed to take apart painting in order to sort of cobble together a new kind of picture somehow. And it was that new pictorial experience and viewing experience of the final drawings that seemed to be lacking from the conversation a bit. I'm thinking maybe the geese actually did do something new there, the way that I've been talking about it. But a lot of the other drawings maybe didn't assert that as much. So I decided to try and figure out a way to redress that balance so that there was more kind of attention and focus on the immediacy of the artwork itself and the experience of viewing it. So I went back to painting, and essentially, oddly, this follows the procedure that the drawings used. I actually made a very small painted sketch of this scene that was about 8 by 10 inches of a little strip mall in London, Ontario as the snow was falling. And then I repainted it bigger. So this painting is the repainting of it, and it's 6 feet by 8 feet. But I repainted every single brushstroke as carefully as possible and as accurately as possible to the original, just in large. Sometimes I'd have to cobble together hardware store brushes and trim them down to get the right kind of shape of the bristles, and then stiffen the bristles to get the right kind of new coarseness to the brush that would emulate the smaller scale brushstroke, but now bigger scale. And I'd spend an afternoon just to make one brushstroke or something like that. It was ridiculous. But yeah, people looked at these as paintings in their own right, and so it shifted away from that idea of deconstruction, which was still happening in the background of these works, but pushed the emphasis on the encounter with this picture on the wall, this painted picture on the wall. One of the weird things that happened here, though, was in the smaller 8 by 10 inch study, those little, in that case, those small dabs of paint that indicated flakes of falling snow seemed quite comfortable. When it got to the 6 by 8 foot scale, and you're standing in front of these things, these blobs get quite big, kind of ridiculously so a bit. They seemed a little bit absurd on that surface. And they kind of, they separated the painting into two different kinds of actions a bit. So there's this one mode of painting where it's using paint to develop a representational space. So when you're doing that as a painter, you're creating this imaginary. And so you want people to forget they're looking at paint on a flat surface. You want them to invest in this imaginary space that's not actually there. There aren't two people there, there isn't snow, there aren't cars, but you want them to go there. But then these great blobs of paint over the surface, they assert something really different. They're about the literal paint and the flat surface that they're stuck to. And so when I was applying these blobs of paint on the picture, it actually felt like, I don't know if this makes sense, it's hard to describe, but I was painting on a painting. It felt like a kind of form of vandalism almost. But it asserts these two different modes of the medium. And it did kind of contradict that representational space and the representational mode of that scene that was underneath them, because these blobs asserted their materiality and asserted the flatness of the surface they were on. But what was surprising to me was that they also, at moments when I was standing in front of it, usually late at night, there'd be a little shift suddenly, and suddenly these blobs of paint that were these supposed snowflakes would kind of seem to slightly hover in front of the picture plane, and the representational space would actually become enhanced and deeper behind them. So it would like open up this kind of space, and then it would collapse again. And then I found as I stood in front of it, I could kind of make it happen. So it was quite magical for me. So I was there transforming great blobs of paint into falling snow.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Did you do the blobs of snow after the background was finished?
Yeah.
And did you take a photograph of that before you put the snow on?
No. But damn it, I should have.
Yeah.
Because I was repainting a small painting and duplicating each stroke, there was a difficulty, because that original painting had, in that original painting, there would have been this brushstroke probably continued right through there, right? And then later on, that dab of snow falling was put on. Because when you paint a snowy scene, you don't plan gaps for every snowflake, right? But then when I'm taking that smaller painting as the model for this bigger one, now I don't have the information of what's happening underneath that. So sometimes I would fudge it and carry on the brushstroke, but quite often I think I would carry on that brushstroke and stop it there and make a new one there. So there'd be gaps in it, and these snowflakes would get put on their spot on top, because it was laid out for me in advance. So it was a bit different than the original painting, how it unfolded. I'm straying from your question, I think. But it did look funny until the final snowflakes were put on as well.
Did the small one have the same depth as that one does?
Yeah, I think so. I think more comfortably so immediately, because like I say, somehow on a smaller scale, even though the ratio of the blobs of the little dabs of paint that were snowflakes, the ratio of them to the overall scene was the same as it is here, but suddenly when it's much bigger and you're standing in front of it, those dabs of paint that are the snowflakes just become kind of seemingly too big. So there wasn't really much of a contest between those snowflakes and the image, the representational space in the small one, but there's much more of a contest between them here and here. It's oil. And then, so I did a number of different snow pictures. I was living in Ontario after all. But then I started looking for other opportunities for a similar kind of situation to explore. So one of the things I looked at was people smoking. And so I did a Google search, just images of people smoking. It was a very generic search, and I'd get all these images back, and I couldn't tell you exactly why I would choose one over another, but certain portraits seemed maybe interesting to paint for one reason or another, so I paint these portraits, and these faces, and they provided the backdrop for these great gobs of paint. I really wanted to push it further and see what would happen. But I tried to push it always to a point where I could still make that space open up, where these great gobs of paint would make it as difficult as possible for me to open that space up, but where it would still happen. And I was really interested in that because I really wanted to challenge the viewer as well. I'm the first viewer of the work, but everyone else who comes to look at it too to become conscious that they can make the picture, that they can make that representational space open up, and they can make these great blobs of gray paint hover in front of the picture like puffs of smoke. So again, it's that idea that the viewer has the agency to make the work functional and has a role there, and can become conscious of that. And there's a kind of a magic here where these ridiculous globs of paint become smoke. And they actually become, at moments, I think, so for me they do anyway, and other people maybe just politely have agreed with me, I don't know, but they become kind of more convincing as clouds of smoke than if I had painted the smoke in a meticulous fashion with like a 000 brush. You know? Because, and it seems to be about the way that the blobs of paint assert themselves physically into our space, and the physicality of the paint gets confused with the physicality of smoke. Whereas that representational space opens up behind them. So here's the girl smoker. And there's also a kind of an interest in here and a play in here about, I'm just thinking about how can paint ever get at a person or represent a person, all the depths and complexities of a person. So I'm thinking about portraiture here. And it's kind of ironically, the medium that's allowing this portrait to exist and open up for us is also the thing that we're trying to see it through, to find it. It's also blocking it out. Here's a golfer. This is a slightly later series, but it looks essentially like the same thing, because I mean, the blobs are different, the portrait's different, but later on in this series of work, I shifted things a little bit in my Google search, my image search. I just, rather than just doing a generic search for people smoking, I added a qualifier of discipline. So I looked for philosophers smoking, I looked for particle physicists smoking, I looked for cultural anthropologists smoking, I looked for I said philosophers, right? I looked for psychologists smoking. I'm trying to think of all of them. There were priests smoking. Had a number of different philosophers. I did break them down into different kinds, like Cartesian and so on. I can't remember all of them, but this is a neurologist smoking. And the thinking there is that, well, painting's interesting stuff. Paint is interesting stuff, and so this idea that paint can magically, say, transform itself from this otherwise inert material into smoke. Well, that's already pretty fantastic, if you ask me. Fascinating. But also that it can embody ideas or ways of thinking, ways of understanding the world. So, a neurologist understands or sees the world presumably differently than a particle physicist might. So there's this idea that in front of this portrait, these great gray blobs of paint embody different ideas than they do when they cover the physicist's face. But again, it's only if the viewer goes, oh yeah, that's cool, I can let that out. Here's a bit more of an illustrative example. That's the top of a philosopher's head at the bottom there, and these gobs of gray paint are sort of drifting up, almost like thought bubbles. And then I'm just showing you a few images of these series, but then the blobs of gray paint escape the portraits altogether, drifting off into this sort of dark void, and then they become even more open to whatever potential you want to imagine into them or not. So it becomes kind of a meditation on the possibilities or the potential of paint and painting and art and the cultural enterprise. Trying to remember what comes next. Earlier, I found this thing on the ferry when I was coming across. I could use this tab here and slide the images from one to the next. It doesn't seem to work, maybe because it's hooked up to this projector, but I could sort of do a little peek without giving it away. But, oh yeah. Okay. So yes, I made snow paintings in Ontario, and I moved back to Vancouver to teach it every time. I made rain paintings, and it was small advancements in certain ways at first, because I was interested in the smokers and the snow paintings. These blobs of paint were these great kind of obscuring things. They were these opaque clots of stuff. And here, the paint still is this opaque stuff that's sort of clotted together. But there's a possibility in a moment where it becomes like a droplet of water, this kind of clear lens through which everything is refracted. So you can look at them as just these gobs of colored paint, or you can start to see the figure in all of them inverted, right? So there's this weird kind of transformation back and forth that way. I like how there's this representational field, and now because of the activity in these blobs, they become like these, this representational field is interrupted by these little abstract paintings that are kind of strewn across it. It's quite ridiculous. So yeah, I'm thinking about, again, representation and abstraction. And I'm thinking about, again, there's this kind of commonplace moment. Just someone on the street, and potentially we're looking at them through a car window that's got droplets of water on it, or something like that. And yet each of these droplets of water, potentially it's like contains the infinite, because it refracts everything from all around it. And the abstraction has this kind of, if I said that the sublime or the infinite can't be represented directly, well, abstraction has made in the past claims to deal with that, right? So again, there's this play between representation and abstraction. And sort of what I talked about before, about how language likes to define things in terms of oppositions that might not accurately reflect the reality of things. I'm now really confused, because I don't see this difference between representation and abstraction at all anymore. I mean, it was already a difficult kind of thing to maintain an opposition between them for many reasons, but now I see them as, I actually see representation as a specialized form of abstraction, actually. And I could try and explain that later maybe. So I made paintings like this. Here's another one that's a little more recent. This is through a kind of misty glass, still with the droplets on it. Here's one where the stanchion at the side of the windshield is covering most of the bottom left corner of the picture. And then in that kind of mode where I've been working, where I've been enlarging paintings and recreating them brushstroke by brushstroke, like I've shown you with actually the smokers were made that way as well as the snow pictures. I neglected to mention that the smoker portraits all came from initial smaller pictures, smaller paintings that I made that I enlarged as well. So in keeping with that mode of working, I started taking details of these pictures. The droplets suggested themselves as being the most interesting details to work with, and enlarging them into their own paintings. And as meticulously, again, as possible, as rigorously as possible, recreating each brushstroke as accurately as I could. But now these things, the paint is becoming really unmanageable when it gets to this thickness and this scale. I mean, these aren't huge paintings. This one's about 30 inches wide. But the paint's pretty goofy, hard to control. So the paint has agency here. Stuff happens. So now here, this is sort of what I mean by this confusion between representation and abstraction, because for all intents and purposes, as a colleague of mine at Emily Carr, art historian Patrick Anderson, described these as hyper-representational, but they, for all appearances, they seem like incredibly abstract at the same time. These both are from that last, more readable picture of the girl with the blue umbrella that I just showed. Well, that's a close-up. It's hard to show in images the kind of body of the paint. So hopefully this is a close-up that gives a bit of an idea. And you can kind of see, like, I can't control this. The paint will do what it'll do. So I do the best I can. And something unexpected happens. I sort of think, I'm hoping that in the best scenarios, these paintings might operate a bit like I was maybe optimistically suggesting those geese drawings operate. I almost said geese drawings. Geese drawings operate as kind of these new propositions where, yes, they've been developed through this kind of odd and long, ridiculous process, but then they become something of their own as well. Here's an installation of the Equinox Gallery, the old Equinox Gallery, where the abstractions were shown alongside of the paintings that they came from. So I don't know where exactly this came from, but from one of those dark squares or rectangles in the painting on the left, the so-called abstraction on the right would have been from that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Sadly, we're going to have to go. One of us has to go to bed. But I wanted to ask you, do you think of these as translations? When you went back to your metaphor of the Tower of Babel, would you show these individually, or do you continue to think of them as translations, and in translating they become more themselves, more the essence of what the original work? I mean, how do you think of them together? Because it seems that you sort of show them chronologically and you display them together, but would you show them individually as a translation, or are they all continuous?
That's a really good question. And it's going to take an hour to answer,
no,
so I'm afraid you can't go to bed. Right? No, I do show them separately as well. That's the short answer, and I have shown them separately, and I think I will again. Yeah, when I suggest that they are kind of potentially a new proposition, I like that idea, and that's where they can stand on their own and have some degree of autonomy as these strange things that are now in the world, and we have to just deal with them. And I like that. And there is, within them, I think there are still hints of their process. The way that they are embodied and formed still relate to representational painting spaces, for example. The way that colors are dispersed through them is very particular, and I could never invent these without the process. So I can't point easily to many very specific parts of them, but on the whole, they seem to somehow, even when they're on their own, they retain some sort of hint of this past process. And even in some cases, like I had, which I'll show, there was an exhibition in Toronto that I had at Jessica Bradley Art and Projects, where I only showed the abstractions, and there was this weird sense of shifting scale. I mean, why an abstract painting if it was completely autonomous? It would have nothing to do with a shifting scale, because it just is, right? It's just its own thing. But there was a weird sense, for me, and it wasn't, maybe other people were being polite, and I don't know, but people said that they felt this, that it's like you're magnifying, so you're zooming in on a painting, but that painting over there is zoomed in so much, but the one right next to it, you've zoomed in even more. So oddly for me, as I sort of scanned around the room, it felt like I was getting bigger and smaller. I was kind of ungrounded a bit because of that. So that's in relation to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So these are some more pictures from that show at Equinox. So they were shown, yes, with the picture they came from, but they were also sort of within one exhibition, kind of separated from the paintings, even though the other paintings that they were built from were in the same room. So there were different kinds of methods for explaining. Here's some individual shots of these ones. This one's called Detail of a Painting That No Longer Exists, because it's actually a detail of a painting that no longer exists. The detail is much better than the painting that came from, I think. And here's that show at Jessica Bradley Art Projects in Toronto that I was just mentioning, where it was only the so-called abstractions that were shown. kind of untethered from their sources.
You've done them in different sizes.
Yeah, yeah. I zoom in and scale up, and I don't think that there's, I don't know that there's a standard size they should be. So I've always done this to some extent with the representational paintings as well. Every picture, before I make it, I sort of spend some time thinking about what is the ideal scale for this picture. And if there's a person in it, well, that gives me a really good starting point, because you know that scene where there are those two people in the parking lot with the snow falling, you can see they're a certain distance away. So how big would a person be when they're 15 feet away from you? And then you build the painting around that scale. So there is that sense. These, it's a little harder. So these can be any scale, it seems. So, but I look at the forms and I look at the ground that they're on and so on, and I don't know, it's more, in this case, with the figures and the space, there are some easier rules that you might point to. You might need to break them for various reasons at different times, but it's easier to sort of describe why they would be a certain scale. For these ones, it feels, I guess it's more intuitive somehow. It just feels right at a certain size. Sometimes I'm wrong. Lots of times I'm wrong.
And can you touch base back, there was a, when you were talking about seeing the Tom Thompson for the first time, and you were like, oh, there you are. And then you took the birds and blew them up.
Blew up the birds.
Blew up the birds. And then the background became, it didn't make sense to you anymore in the Tom Thompson painting?
The background made sense to me, but it wasn't the focus of what I was interested in.
So then in these works, I see sort of a similar concept.
But I'm maintaining back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that, yeah, that's suggesting possibilities to me.
Yeah.
Of moving them forward as forms independent of the ground. Yeah. I guess, I've found that the backgrounds, as they get enlarged, also do interesting things setting up the space. And maybe, but yeah, I mean, they help to maintain that kind of link to the process. But it might be really interesting to excise them from that process even further, to separate them from the process even further and allow them, to become maybe more autonomous things as a result of that. Yeah, thank you. Your clock ticking.
What did you use for the body of your paint?
It's oil paint, and I've tried to keep the recipe really, really simple because it's tricky when the paint gets this thick. For archival reasons, it gets kind of difficult. I've taken to right now, I mix in a bit of cold wax medium, and that seems to, I did, at first I tried all kinds of mediums to help speed the drying and stuff, so it sort of set up and hardened faster, and that I think, it worked in varying degrees, but it did different things to the paint, so that it didn't stand up with the sharp peaks to the brushwork and so on as much as I might have liked. Each possibility has its own strengths and weaknesses. The wax medium is really helpful because, well, if you use straight oil paint on its own, as it dries, it decreases in volume. So what will happen with a big blob of oil paint, like with this, you've got a certain volume of paint there, and a skin forms over it, right? But then the paint underneath is still all wet. And so some of these conservators told me, 15, 20 years before it dries and cures, right? So during that time, it's the paint inside is like shrinking, right? But the skin over the surface was formed at this larger volume, right? So the paint shrinks and that wrinkles the skin on top. And those wrinkles, you'll see them in old paintings. Yeah, look at it in a Reeves, you see it. Gerhard Richter's got a lot of that in some of his paintings, so where the paint's thicker, his abstractions. Those wrinkles, the conservators call that pre-cleavage, which is a lovely term. But cleavage meaning that's before the paint cracks, which is not a good thing, because cleavage is pre-paint falling off onto the floor, essentially. So the cold wax medium is really great because it sets up with temperature, more so than over time with airflow. I mean, it's a bit of both, but it seems to maintain the volume of the paint, and then the paint dries at that volume. So that seems to be one really useful thing about it. But mixing too much in can cause problems, so you have to be careful. This one's called 12th Avenue Lemon. I realize I haven't been telling you titles, but that's because I don't remember most of the titles. Anyway, these are essentially where I'll end your suffering. And that just takes us back around to this cycling pose.
Does anyone have any questions?
I've got a question, observation. You opened up your discussion partly alluding to your hose and its discussion. Well, no, and the relationship between the hose and the wall and the figure ground relationship.
Right.
As you got into your discussion, talking about the snow painting as a way in which when you blew it up, the large clumps of snow also had this figure ground relationship. You could sit there in your studio at night and catch yourself getting behind those big blobs of paint. Mm-hmm. Even onto the rain paintings where you get a sense of the tactility of the paint in the drops and then get behind them. As the paintings progressed into more direct abstraction, that opportunity to get behind seems to lessen. You can still get behind, red sits in front of blue, that kind of thing, but the direct kind of paradox of alluding to this three-dimensional space is no longer really apparent. And I'm curious as to, at what time in your process or your practice of painting did that kind of sitting there in amazement of it being a flat surface as well as a deep space start to become, in my mind, they become more painterly and more very much about the two-dimensional surface as opposed to alluding to that three-dimensional possibility of space?
I don't know. Thanks, it's a nice observation. I think that in the abstractions, well, you kind of did say this, that space does still open up, but to a lesser degree. I mean, these singular forms are cropped in on, but there are some cases where the surrounding paint is built up as well, and it kind of smushes together and becomes uniform, and much less of a gap opens up. And there are other ones that are, the background is treated kind of in a blurry or gradation fashion, and it opens up that space more. But yeah, it's absolutely true. It's lessened. I don't know. I don't think that there's an easy way for me to answer that, because it wasn't probably a very conscious decision. I mean,
well, I'm sure it wasn't.
And I probably got interested in the things that have been going on in the abstractions that are not so much about that relationship anymore. But I think that having, well, so far, I would say that having a residue of that happening, or a slight amount of that happening in them, is still really interesting to me, because I like these I think of them as, what's the word? They're kind of paradoxical things because they, like I said, you could think of them as hyper-representational as well as being these kind of more autonomous, physical, immediate abstractions, right? Literal paint on surface. And I think I play with that in different ways all the way through. So I don't know, I didn't really talk about a couple of things. Can I go back? Yeah, so some things that, it's interesting to me, the rounding of the corners, for example. That was kind of an intuitive decision at the time. I didn't really know why I was doing it entirely, but it seemed to fit. And reflecting on it, it seems that it was, I like the decision because it makes the painting a shape, so it asserts its material objectness as a thing. It's now a bit of a shaped panel, right? But at the same time, it's like when you take a square and enlarge it. Essentially, its resolution goes down, and the edges get softened, and the corners get softened. And then, as other people have mentioned it, they kept thinking about IMAX and this kind of shape of the iMac and so on is this digital tool that I've been using to photograph these and enlarge them, actually. So there's this kind of quality of the image that's apparent, the enlarged image that's being referenced in the corners. So this space of imagery, which is about figure ground, right? It's that representational space, is being kind of supported in different moments in these works throughout. But it's a weird thing because it's doing these seemingly contradictory things. It's asserting the objectness as it's asserting the imageness. And similarly, these are now on different weaves of burlap. So, I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, but it's so straightforward as to say, like, I've enlarged the weave of the canvas. So again, it's like asserting this material presence of a thing and asserting this image quality through that operation. So there's this kind of weird, paradoxical relationship to these things that are seemingly two different, they carry two different aspects that shouldn't sit together at once. I don't know if I'm online with what you were asking.
No, it's great, yeah. I noticed a particular transition with the rain paintings. All of a sudden, that glob of paint had many more possibilities of being a subject unto itself.
Right. Yeah.
And your discussion about them in the particular painting being like lenses, having the inverse images of the figure, like our brains work, so it's flipped upside down with lenses, and that it's a very deep discussion into looking and seeing. Right. You know, it's really interesting.
I think that one thing that seems to be happening in these to me is that there's painting's interesting because it seems to operate at a certain threshold. It constantly is existing. It's constantly oscillating from one side of this certain threshold to another, between the physical space that we're standing in as we look at a painting and the imaginary space. And I did talk about that. Obviously, that's what we were talking about with the snow falling and the smokers and that. The blobs of paint asserting themselves physically, but that depth of representational space opening up for us. But and it's also, this is also, let's see if I can try and say this in a way that makes sense and doesn't take too long. There's also something about this that's connected to that idea of the viewers transforming paint or an inert material into something that it is not. So paint into smoke, or paint into snow, paint into water. Sort of like King Midas touching things and turning them to gold. So what am I trying to say? We're, it was when you were talking about how vision works. When we, like neuroscientists have written about how in the visual cortex, there are sort of 5 centers to our visual cortex. So image, our eye sees something, inverted. The image is fired through the optic nerve to the first center of the visual cortex. But a really rapid cursory signal is sent to the top, to the 5th center, the command center. And it's interesting because in that command center, there's a quick decision that's made about what it is that we're seeing and how we should interpret the visual data that's coming in, the visual information that's coming in. So the command center, the 5th stage of the cortex, starts sending messages down to the 1st stage to tell the 1st stage how to interpret the messages coming in. And then it moves progressively on to the 2nd one. And it keeps sending images back down to tell how to deal with and refine and resolve this image that we're forming in our brains of what we think we saw, and so on. And it turns out, apparently, that there are roughly 10 times as many messages going out from our brain as there are coming in. So that's just a small example of how we kind of, I don't think you can quite break it down mathematically like this, but that would mean that, if you do it in a straight kind of way, it's over 90% of what we think we see out there is actually invented in here. So this kind of world that we inhabit is an imaginary, I would say. We do create models or understandings or ideas of how the world is, what it is, how it operates. We have these pictures, these worldviews, these models that we're constantly adapting to our surroundings, but that we project out there in order that we can negotiate things and navigate our lives, essentially. At every moment we're doing this. And, but every so often, as we're projecting this imaginary space before us and walking down the street, we'll stub our toe on the curb. And we'll go, ow! And then we'll have to account for that, right? And so our worldview changes slightly to remember that curb and account for this uneven ground here. So, is this making any sense? Painting opens up this imaginary space. That's that threshold. That's like our worldview, the imaginary that we live in, that we kind of create, adapt in our heads to account for our surroundings. But painting also crosses over into this physical existence. So it's constantly, and as we look at it, we're cycling through that threshold. So for me, painting's been a really interesting way to think about that, to think about how we exist in the world, how we understand it, how we perceive it, and how we navigate it. And so I think that's why I'm constantly drawn to the medium, because it seems really useful in that discussion. Did that make any sense?
It made a lot of sense.
Oh, thank you. You're so kind.
No, my art history class taught me about those navigations in your brain, so I understood. But I find these paintings disturbing because I have no context. I have no reference for them. They're different than anything I've ever seen. And I go to my design class and I'm looking for balance and theme and color. But there's no context. It's really interesting.
Thank you. I like that. One thing that I'm prone to over-rationalizing everything. I'm always rationalizing. I think the Western brain is like this largely. I might be afflicted by this more than most people, I'm not sure. So I'm always trying to make sense of things. And I don't think the world is a sensible place, really. I think that we use language to try to make sense of things and try and build a world that we can understand and we can navigate. But sort of like I was saying before, language, how it creates oppositions in order to define things based on what they are not. So, before, when language came along and defined a hill, there's a hill. But before that, the hill was continuous with the valley, right? Now language sort of takes it, removes it from its context, and provides a definition based on what it isn't. It's a weird way of being in the world. It is a kind of weird way of rationalizing the world.
But what you have created is something completely unique that no one has ever seen
Right.
before.
So, well, maybe.
No,
but I think when I look back at this, like when I put a talk like this together and I look back at it, I think that I've been trying to develop ways to escape my own rationalizing, right? Because it's a way of trying to make sense of things that is invariably flawed. You know? So I've in the past tried many ways to escape that fail miserably. I mean, if I go out and deliberately try to do something wacky and crazy that would be totally unlike me, well, then it's immediately I go, you're doing that, Ben, because you're wanting to escape your rationality. You're rationalizing. So I'm trapped in it. Suddenly it makes sense, right? In this weird kind of way. So I think that one thing that I seem to do is I've taken an opposite strategy to that, and I take these objective or kind of rational processes, like how scientists would do it. You know, you want to understand painting, you put it under a magnifying glass, you enlarge it. You look at it more closely. But I do it in a kind of perverse or extreme way, so that it becomes kind of arguably maybe hyper-rational. It becomes absurd, and then something else starts to happen, hopefully like you're describing.
I think it's now